Rain hammered the hills around Seneca Lake on a November night when a black Escalade pulled off Route 14 and crawled down the dirt road toward a small farmhouse, glowing faintly through the storm. Inside, a retired Neapolitan Mastiff named Nero, 140 pounds of black wrinkled muscle and mournful amber eyes, suddenly lifted his massive head from the bedroom doorway, where he'd been sleeping every night for 18 months, waiting for someone who never came home. His whole body went rigid, a deep growl rolling through his chest like an engine turning over in the dark. On the porch stood a man who didn't belong there, 6'2", broad-shouldered, wearing a tailored black suit soaked through with rain, one hand pressed against his left side, where blood seeped slowly between his fingers and dripped onto the old wooden boards. His steel-gray eyes swept the entire property in 3 seconds flat: the back door, the upstairs windows, the distance to the main road, the 2 pairs of old shoes by the entrance, before his voice came out calm enough to make the rain sound louder than his words. "Can I stay here just one night?" What the elderly couple didn't know was that the wounded stranger standing on their porch wasn't just any man running from trouble. He was one of the most powerful and ruthless crime bosses on the entire East Coast, a man who'd built his empire on the simple principle that every person was either useful or disposable. And what he didn't know yet was that the missing daughter whose photograph hung on every wall inside that farmhouse, the girl whose empty bedroom the old dog guarded each night, had disappeared 18 months ago because of an order he'd given over the phone in 4 words and never thought about again. What happened over the next few days inside that little house by the lake would force a man who'd never felt guilt to finally face what he'd destroyed, and nothing under that roof would ever be the same. If this story grabs you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and share this with someone who loves a good story. Now let's go back to that rainy night on Seneca Lake, where Nero's growl was still rumbling through the farmhouse, and the stranger hadn't stepped inside yet. Rick stepped across the threshold, and Nero moved with him at once, 4 heavy paws settling onto the wooden floor, exactly 1 pace behind him, no closer and no farther, as if the dog had drawn an invisible line for itself, a line that would change everything if this strange man crossed it. Walter Aldridge stood in the middle of the entrance to the living room, the oak cane he had turned himself on his own machine, gripped firmly in his right hand, the tip pointed toward the floor but ready to rise at any second. He was 79 years old, tall and thin, his back more deeply bent with every passing year, but his gray-blue eyes were still sharp in the way only the eyes of men who had survived battlefields could be. 50 years ago, Walter had served in the elite 101st Airborne Division, surviving battlefields that shaped him. And though his body had grown old, his instinct for judging danger had never disappeared. He looked Rick over from head to toe, slowly, carefully, taking in every detail that an old carpenter usually wouldn't need to notice, but that a veteran would never overlook. Ruth Aldridge was nearly a head shorter than her husband, 75 years old, her white silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck, her fragile frame wrapped in a pale blue sweater with frayed cuffs, a sweater her daughter had given her for the last Christmas before she vanished. She saw the blood on Rick's hand before she saw his face, and the instinct to care for someone, rooted deep after decades of volunteering at the town clinic, overpowered every trace of fear. "Go into the kitchen," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Then she coughed twice, dry and rough, as the wind slipped through the door before it could be closed. Rick sat down on the wooden chair beside the kitchen table under the yellow light, while Ruth took the first aid kit from the high cabinet. Her hands trembled, her small fingers fumbling with the roll of white gauze, but when she pulled the edge of Rick's suit jacket aside and saw the wound in his left ribs, she stopped for exactly 1 breath, not longer than that. Just long enough for her to recognize that what she was looking at wasn't a cut from car metal or a shard of broken glass. She had lived 75 years in the countryside, where hunting season stretched from October to January, and she knew what a bullet wound through soft tissue looked like. Ruth didn't ask. She wiped away the blood, applied antiseptic, wrapped the bandage just tightly enough, and said nothing about what her hands had just touched. There are questions old people learn not to ask, because sometimes the answer is more dangerous than not knowing. Rick said he was a real estate investor from New York, on his way to inspect a project when a truck struck him from the side on a dark stretch of road near the lake, and he had crawled out of the car and walked until he saw the lights of the farm. His voice was smooth, his rhythm even, the details specific enough to be believable but not so many that they became suspicious. Walter stood leaning against the kitchen door frame, listening from beginning to end without interrupting. When Rick finished, the old man only nodded once, then turned to put more firewood into the fireplace, as if the story wasn't worth any further comment. But he didn't put down the oak cane, and he didn't sit with his back turned toward Rick for the rest of that night. Nero lay down on the kitchen floor, exactly 3 paces from the legs of Rick's chair, his muzzle resting on his 2 front paws, his amber eyes wide open in the yellow light. The dog no longer growled, but he didn't close his eyes either. He lay there the way a guard lies, absolutely alert, watching every time Rick lifted his hand, and every time Rick exhaled. The night wind whistled through the cracks of the old window, making Ruth cough through another long spell, a dry, deep sound from her chest that both husband and wife had heard too often to be frightened by anymore. Rick looked at the 2 old people in the small kitchen, warm with the smell of burning wood and old coffee, looked at Walter's trembling hand around a cup of water, looked at Ruth pulling the pale blue sweater tighter around her shoulders each time the wind slipped in. And he understood something that 15 years in the underworld had taught him to recognize before anything else. These were people who had endured too much for too long with no one to help them. And people like that, when someone finally appears and reaches out a hand, will take it before they think to check whether that hand is clean. The next morning, Rick woke on the living room sofa before even the rooster crowed out in the coop, and the first thing he did wasn't check his wound. It was observe. That was the habit of a man who survived by reading a room before the room could read him. The living room was small, but it was clean to a point that felt almost stubborn. The oak floor polished despite being old and worn. The white window curtains washed regularly even though their edges had yellowed, and on every wall, the face of the same young woman looked back at him from every corner of the house. Colette Aldridge's photographs were everywhere. A small wooden frame on the mantel showed her in a white hospital blouse on the day she graduated from nursing school. Amber eyes bright, her smile wide with the innocence of someone who didn't yet know the world could take everything away in a single night. A larger photograph hanging near the kitchen door showed the whole family standing beside Seneca Lake in the summer. Walter, a few years younger and straighter in the back. Ruth laughing without coughing. Colette standing between them as if she were the one thing keeping them upright. And another smaller photograph on the hallway windowsill showed Colette sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding a wrinkled black puppy about the size of a pillow, with drooping ears and sleepy amber eyes. Nero. Rick looked from the photograph to the dog lying at the end of the hallway, in front of a half-open bedroom door, and he understood that the enormous mastiff had grown up in this house with the girl in the picture. He stood, walked slowly down the hall, and Nero lifted his head to watch him, but didn't growl, only followed him with those heavy amber eyes. The door at the end of the hallway stood open just wide enough for the early light to slip through. Inside was a small room preserved exactly as if its owner had only stepped out to buy coffee and would be back any moment. A single bed was covered with spotless white sheets, without a single wrinkle. A pair of white nursing shoes sat neatly on the floor beside the foot of the bed. A denim jacket hung on a hook behind the door. A small vase on the nightstand held several fresh flowers that had already half wilted, yet someone was still changing the water regularly. Rick stood at the threshold and looked into that room, and he understood at once that this wasn't the room of someone who had died. This was the room of someone being waited for. Ruth appeared behind him with both hands around a tea tray, and when she saw Rick standing in front of her daughter's room, her pale blue eyes changed in a way no polite expression could ever imitate. "Letty," she said softly, as if the name were both a prayer and a wound. She set the tea tray down on the living room table, then lowered herself heavily into a seat, and without Rick needing to ask, she began to tell him. 18 months earlier, Colette had worked the night shift at Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan as she always did, texting Ruth at 10 o'clock that night to say, "I'll be home late, Mom. Don't stay up." And then she vanished. Her phone went dead. No one saw her leave the hospital. No camera recorded her. The New York police investigated for 6 months, turned over every street corner, checked every file, and then closed the case with a note Ruth knew by heart, because she had read it over and over until the paper went soft and wrinkled. Insufficient evidence to continue the investigation. Ruth looked down at her hands in her lap, her small fingers twisting the edge of her pale blue sweater. "Letty was our late miracle," she said. "I was 48 years old when I had her. After so many years thinking I'd never get to be a mother. The doctor called it a miracle. Walter called it a blessing. And all I knew was that child was the reason I woke up every morning." Rick listened with perfect concentration. He furrowed his brow at exactly the right moment when her voice caught. He lowered his voice to just the right tone when he said, "I'm so sorry." He leaned forward just enough to show concern without intruding. Every gesture was as precise as a performance rehearsed 1,000 times. But behind those gray-blue eyes, Rick's mind was processing a completely different kind of information. An isolated farm, 15 minutes by car from the nearest town. 2 old people with no children at home, no neighbors within sight, no security system. Desperate long enough for trust to become something they were ready to hand over to anyone who seemed worthy of it. Rick stood to get Ruth more tea, and as he passed the dining table, his eyes swept over details an ordinary guest would never notice. The front door had 2 locks, the lower one newly installed, its screws still bright and not yet dulled with age. The pipe beneath the kitchen sink was wrapped thickly with electrical tape at the joint, the kind of temporary repair made by someone who couldn't afford to call a plumber or didn't dare let a repairman come to the house. And beneath the stack of old newspapers on the corner of the table, the edge of a white envelope showed just enough for Rick to read the embossed print in the upper left corner. Lakeview Capital Partners. Rick didn't pull the envelope out. He only noticed it, filed it away in his memory with everything else he had observed since stepping through the door of this house, then returned and placed the teacup in front of Ruth with the gentlest smile a man could wear while calculating how to take everything she had. That afternoon, Rick stepped out to the woodshed behind the farm, closed the rotting wooden door behind him, and called Finch Calloway. The phone signal in the Finger Lakes was so weak that Rick had to stand close to the small window facing Seneca Lake before he could clearly hear the voice of the 52-year-old man with salt and pepper hair on the other end of the line, deep and slow as always, but carrying a trace of caution that Rick recognized at once, because Finch only sounded that way when he smelled trouble. "I need everything on the Aldridge family, the farm in Watkins Glen near Seneca Lake," Rick said, "and the full project file on Gordon Price in the Finger Lakes. Every transaction, every phone call, every time Price set foot in Schuyler County. Before tonight." There were 3 seconds of silence on the other end. "What are you doing out there, Rick?" "A long-term investment." Finch didn't ask more, because he had served the Valenti family long enough to know when Rick wanted to explain, and when a question would only waste time. Rick hung up and looked through the woodshed window at the backyard, where Walter was trying to repair the chicken coop gate with one hand because the other shook too badly to hold the hinge straight. Rick watched for a while, then slipped the phone into his pocket, took off his black suit jacket and draped it over a wooden beam, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and walked out into the yard. He didn't ask Walter if he needed help. He simply picked up the screwdriver from the rusty toolbox on the ground, gritting his teeth as the sharp pain from his left ribs flared with every movement, held the hinge straight with one steady hand that didn't tremble, and began tightening the screws. Walter looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once, the short nod of a man who wasn't used to saying thank you, but knew how to acknowledge something. On the second day, Rick cleared the garden drain clogged with mud and debris. Though his freshly bandaged wound throbbed violently, and a small patch of red began to seep through his shirt, he pushed through the pain and dug up the cracked section of pipe, realizing the crack hadn't come from weather or age, but from someone striking the weakest joint with a hard object. Deliberate sabotage, neat and precise, enough to cause damage, but not enough to look intentional to someone who didn't know how to see. Rick knew how to see. On the third day, he replaced the woodshed hinges and repaired the rotting step on the front porch. And that afternoon, while the 2 of them sat on the porch drinking the strong coffee Ruth brewed in the old upstate New York way, Walter began to truly talk for the first time. He spoke not because he trusted Rick, but because his grief had gone 18 months with no one to hear it. And sometimes a stranger is easier to talk to than someone you know, because a stranger doesn't carry the pitying look he was too tired to endure anymore. "She worked the night shift at Mount Sinai," Walter said, his eyes fixed on Seneca Lake in the distance, where the water lay gray and murky beneath the November evening sky. "Emergency department." Every night she called her mother before her shift started, and every morning she texted when she got off. 18 months ago, she called like always and said, "I'm going in now, Mom. Go to bed early." And then by morning there was no message. Her phone was off. The hospital said she left her shift at 2 o'clock in the morning. After that, no one ever saw her again. Walter stopped, his fingers trembling against the side of the coffee cup. May 14th. Rick lifted the cup to his mouth and took a slow sip. His face didn't change. Not one muscle in his jaw tightened. Not one breath came shorter than usual. He had been trained by 15 years of sitting across from enemies without revealing a thing. and that skill now worked perfectly in front of a 79-year-old man, telling him about the worst night of his life. But inside Rick's chest, 3 words were ringing at a volume no one but him could hear. May 14th. The night of May 14th. Red Hook Harbor, Brooklyn, 2:43 in the morning. Rick's phone rang while he was sitting in the VIP room of a club on Atlantic Street. Tommy Slade was on the line, breathless. "Boss, there's trouble. The Red Hook delivery fell apart. 2 Castellano men are down. And there's a girl who walked across the pier and saw everything. I've got her. What do you want me to do?" Rick remembered exactly what glass he had been holding then, a Macallan 18-year, and he remembered exactly how many seconds passed after Tommy finished speaking before he answered. 4 seconds. "Hold her. Don't kill her. I'll decide later." Then he hung up, finished the Macallan, and went back to his unfinished conversation with a banker from New Jersey about opening a new money laundering account. The Red Hook problem became 1 line of notes in the black leather ledger Finch kept, filed between Newark Port Order and Atlantic City Building Permit. And Rick didn't think about it even once after that. He didn't ask the girl's name, how old she was, what she did for a living, or whether anyone was waiting for her to come home. He didn't ask because he didn't care, because in Rick Valenti's world, people fell into 2 kinds, and the girl who had walked through Red Hook that night belonged to the only kind he needed to know, a problem to be handled. Now, 18 months later, Rick was sitting on her parents' porch, drinking coffee her mother had brewed, listening to her father talk about the night his daughter vanished, while he knew exactly where she had been all this time, because he was the one who had ordered her locked away. Walter looked out at the lake, his gray-blue eyes wet but not crying, because he had run out of tears by the 6th month. "The police said there wasn't enough evidence," he said. "But I know my girl didn't just disappear on her own. Letty wasn't like that. She called her mother every night, without missing a single day." Rick nodded slowly, his face carrying the properly solemn expression of a stranger sharing the grief of a family he barely knew. And no one on the porch that afternoon, not Walter, not Ruth, standing in the kitchen wiping her eyes, not Nero lying beneath the chair, could see that what rested quietly behind those calm gray-blue eyes was the truth, and if spoken aloud, it would destroy everything still left in the small house beside Seneca Lake. On the 4th day, Rick was helping Walter replace a rotten plank on the porch floor when Nero suddenly stopped lying down. The black mastiff sprang to his feet so fast the whole plank shook with him, and this time, his reaction was nothing like before. It wasn't the low, steady warning growl he had been giving Rick for the past several days. This was continuous barking, violent and sharp, his teeth flashing white beneath the folds of his wrinkled jaw, his 140-pound body lowering its center of gravity close to the ground, as if he were ready to charge and tear apart anything that came through the gate. Rick followed the dog's eyes and saw a spotless white Land Rover turning onto the dirt road that led to the farm, its tires absurdly clean in the muddy countryside of November. The vehicle stopped in front of the porch, and a man stepped down from the driver's seat, 44 years old, light brown hair combed smooth, beard trimmed into precise lines, wearing a charcoal gray cashmere coat and polished Oxford shoes that reflected the gray sky like 2 small mirrors under his feet. Gordon Price smiled before stepping onto the porch, his smile white and even like a dental advertisement, and behind him, 2 large men in cheap suits stepped out from the rear doors and stood beside the vehicle with their arms crossed over their chests, in a way everyone understood did not mean they were drivers. Ruth appeared at the front door when she heard Nero barking, and her face changed the instant she saw the white Land Rover, not with sudden fear, but with a familiar kind of fear, the fear of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen, because it had happened many times before. Price stepped onto the porch without waiting to be invited, brushed past the screen door Ruth hadn't even managed to open fully, and walked straight into the living room, as if he had owned the place for years, and was only stopping by to inspect his property. Ruth had to use both hands to hold Nero by the collar and pull the enormous dog, still growling and barking without pause, back toward the hallway, his claws scraping against the wooden floor with a shrill sound. "Walter, Ruth," Price said, his voice gentle in the way of a man used to controlling conference rooms. "I've come in good faith one final time. Lakeview Capital is prepared to raise the purchase offer to 40% above the original valuation. This is your last opportunity before the county approves the rezoning around Seneca Lake and your land falls into the acquisition zone." Walter stood in the middle of the living room with his oak cane in hand and looked at Price. with the eyes of a man who had heard this speech 3 times in the past month, each time packaged more beautifully, but with the same thing inside. "I've already told you," Walter answered, his voice steady. "The farm isn't for sale." Price tilted his head to one side, his smile never fading, and Rick sat still on the wooden chair in the corner of the kitchen, observing everything with the absolute concentration of a man watching a play he had written being performed by someone else. Because Rick recognized all of it, the soft but controlling tone, the rezoning data used as a weapon of intimidation, the offer of one final good faith, carrying the hidden meaning that after this, nothing would be gentle anymore. This was the exact script Rick had approved for Price 3 months earlier, in the upstairs private room of the Italian restaurant in Little Italy. Page 12 of the plan Finch had drafted. Phase 3. Final offer. Price increase. Implied consequences. Rick was watching his own errand boy carry out his own orders, and for the first time, he was seeing that script from the side of the people forced to endure it. Price turned his head and noticed Rick for the first time since walking in. His eyes swept quickly from head to toe over the man sitting in the kitchen corner, assessing the clothes that weren't a suit, the bruise on his cheekbone from the ambush night, and the cheap coffee cup in his hand. "Who are you?" Price asked. "A guest," Rick replied. One word. Nothing more. Price frowned, then turned back toward Walter with a smile that now carried a sharper edge. "You two should be careful about inviting strangers into your home," he said, and the sentence wasn't advice, but a reminder that he knew everything happening around this farm. Rick set the coffee cup down on the table slowly and looked at Price. He said nothing. He only looked. But those gray-blue eyes shifted into something Price hadn't expected to see in a guest on a rural farm. A complete stillness, cold and bottomless, the kind of stillness possessed only by someone who had decided the life and death of others many times before. Price lost his composure for half a second. Only half a second. A faint twitch at the corner of his eye, the fingers of his right hand curling and then stretching open again. But it was enough for Rick to notice and file away in memory. Price turned on his heel, walked out the door, and the white Land Rover backed onto the dirt road before disappearing beyond the line of trees. The living room fell silent again, but no one breathed any easier. Ruth collapsed onto the sofa, released Nero's collar, and began coughing violently, the deep sound from her chest filling the room as she clutched herself with both hands and struggled to draw air between the spasms. Walter stood still for a moment, then struck the table with his fist hard enough to make the coffee cup tremble, not because he was angry at Price, but because he was powerless, because he knew one final time didn't mean Price would stop. It meant that next time, there would be no smile attached. Nero sat pressed against Ruth's legs, his head resting on her thigh, and kept growling softly toward the front door, long after the white vehicle had vanished from sight. Rick remained seated where he was, not speaking, not standing, not offering comfort, only watching the 2 old people in the small, warm living room shake because of a man Rick himself had released into their lives. Rick waited until Ruth stopped coughing, and Walter led her into the bedroom to rest, before he stepped out to the woodshed for the second time that week, closed the door, and called Finch. This time, he didn't speak slowly. "Cut Price off," Rick said the moment Finch picked up. "Freeze every Lakeview Capital account through our bank in Jersey. Pull his real estate business license in Schuyler County. Use our people on the county board. Call in every loan he's holding through the shell companies. I'm taking direct control of the entire Finger Lakes division." Finch went silent on the other end, and Rick heard the click of a ballpoint pen, Finch's habit whenever he was weighing whether to say something Rick might not want to hear. "Change of plan?" Finch finally asked. "Change of game," Rick answered. "Price uses a hammer, smashes drains, breaks water pipes, sends threatening letters, drags 2 big men to people's homes. Crude. Inefficient. This family isn't afraid of hammers because they've already lost something more important than any piece of land." He stopped, looking through the crack in the woodshed door toward the little house where the kitchen light had just gone out. "I use my bare hands. I help them, fix their house, protect them from Price, and when they trust me deeply enough, they'll sign the land over willingly because they'll think it's the right thing to do for their property. No forcing, no threats. They'll invite me to sit at the table and push the papers across themselves." There were 5 seconds of silence on the other end of the line. Rick counted every second, because with Finch, 5 seconds of silence was the same as a 2-page speech of objection. "That's an old man with Parkinson's disease and an old woman coughing up blood, Rick." Finch said, his voice even, but each word set down clearly, like a man reading an indictment. Rick didn't hesitate. And their land sits in the exact strategic position for the Seneca Lake Resort project, large enough for Phase 1, and according to the county's latest valuation, its current value is $12 million. Cut price off before midnight. He hung up. The Valenti family machine moved faster than any administrative system in America when Rick gave a direct order. Within 2 days, everything Gordon Price had built over 2 years in the Finger Lakes began collapsing in a sequence Price couldn't understand, because he didn't know he was being crushed by his own boss. The main account of Lakeview Capital Partners was frozen by the bank in New Jersey, which Price didn't know was secretly owned by Valenti. His 2 largest investment partners pulled their capital on the same day, without explaining why. His real estate business license in Schuyler County was suspended for review under new regulations by a county board member Finch had bought 3 years earlier. Price's private attorney suddenly stopped answering his phone. By the 3rd day, Gordon Price sat in the Lakeview Capital office in Rochester, staring at a computer screen that showed an account balance of 0, unable to understand why the sky had fallen onto his head. The white Land Rover no longer appeared on the dirt road leading to the Aldridge farm. Letters from Lakeview Capital stopped coming. The phone stopped ringing. And Walter Aldridge, the 79-year-old man who had grown used to watching something else in his life get broken every week, suddenly realized that ever since the strange man had walked into his house on that rainy night, the things that had been breaking him had slowly begun to stop. He didn't thank Rick, because he wasn't the kind of man who trusted that quickly. But he stopped holding the oak cane every time Rick passed by. And Ruth, for the first time in 18 months, cooked dinner for more than 2 people. She made roast chicken from the old recipe Colette loved most, mashed potatoes with butter and thyme, cornbread baked in the cast-iron pan that had been used for 3 generations, and a pot of hot tea placed in the center of the table. The Aldridge family dining table had 4 chairs, but for the past 18 months, only 2 had been used. Walter's chair at the head of the table and Ruth's chair on the left. The chair on the right belonged to Colette, always left empty, and the chair at the far end across from Walter was one no one sat in because its uselessness was too much of a reminder. That night, Ruth set 3 plates on the table, and when Rick sat down, he sat in the chair on the right, Colette's chair. Ruth looked at him sitting there, and her hand paused for a moment over the spoon she was using to scoop the potatoes, her pale blue eyes blinking quickly twice before she turned away and said nothing, only placing a larger spoonful of potatoes than usual onto Rick's plate. Walter sat at the head of the table, looking at his wife, looking at Rick, looking at the chair, and he said nothing either. Nero lay beneath the table between the legs of the 3 people, his muzzle resting on the floor, his amber eyes open but quieter than they had been on any previous night. Outside the kitchen window, the November sky was black, and the rain had stopped for the first time all week. And inside the small kitchen, warm with the smell of roast chicken and cornbread, 3 people sat around the dining table without anyone mentioning the 4th empty chair that was no longer empty, without anyone mentioning the girl in the photograph on the wall smiling down at them, and without anyone knowing that the man sitting in her place was the reason she couldn't sit there herself. That night, Rick couldn't sleep. The wound in his left ribs had begun to heal, but it still throbbed every time he turned on the living room sofa, and at around 2 o'clock in the morning, he gave up trying to keep his eyes closed, stood, and walked toward the bathroom at the end of the downstairs hallway. The hall was dark, with only moonlight slipping through the small window at the top of the stairs, laying a long silver strip across the wooden floor, and Rick moved with soundless steps, driven by the instinct of a man used to traveling through darkness without wanting anyone to know where he was. He passed Colette's room at the end of the hallway and stopped. The door stood slightly open, as it always did, because Ruth never closed that door, and Nero would scratch at it all night if anyone did. Moonlight from the bedroom window slanted through the crack, spilling a thin wash of silver over the white bedsheets, and on the wooden floor beside the foot of the bed, the white nursing shoes still sat neatly in the exact place Ruth arranged them every week. Nero lay right beside the shoes, his huge, black, wrinkled muzzle resting on them, his amber eyes open, and when Rick stopped at the threshold, the dog didn't growl, didn't stand, only turned those amber eyes toward him. 2 creatures looked at each other in the dark. Rick looked at the dog lying with his muzzle on the shoes of the missing woman, patient, tireless, night after night after night for 18 months, waiting for the footsteps he remembered, the scent he remembered, the hand he remembered. And Rick stood there longer than any man merely passing by needed to stop. He stood there long enough for the moonlight to shift 1 centimeter across the bedsheet. Long enough to realize that he was looking into this room, not because it was on the way to the bathroom, but because something in the sight of that dog waiting over those white shoes made him unable to move on. He couldn't name that thing. Rick Valenti didn't have the vocabulary for this kind of feeling, because he had starved that part of himself for far too long. The phone in his pants pocket vibrated, and Rick stepped back from the threshold, moved quickly out to the front porch, and answered. Finch's voice on the other end sounded tighter than usual. There's a problem. The Red Hook witness girl. She escaped from the safe house in Pittsburgh. Rick stood still in the middle of the porch, the night wind from Seneca Lake blowing cold through his thin shirt. When did she escape? 2 days ago. Tommy got drunk during the night watch. She broke the lock on the basement bathroom window and crawled out. Tommy only found out the next morning, hunting for her desperately on his own. But he didn't dare report it to you, because he knows what losing a witness means in the Valenti house. Rick tightened his grip around the phone. 3 days, and no one told me? Tommy went looking for her himself, hoping to catch her before you found out. He checked her personnel records at Mount Sinai and got her hometown address. She's from upstate New York. Silence. The wind pushed dry leaves rolling across the wooden porch. Upstate New York, Rick repeated, his voice even. She's out there somewhere, Finch said. Maybe trying to get home. Maybe hiding in a shelter along the way. We don't know. But if Tommy found her hometown address, it's only a matter of time. Rick turned and looked through the screen door into the dark house, where the back hallway led to the room with the white shoes and the black dog, where the walls were filled with photographs of the amber-eyed girl this family had been searching for without stopping for 18 months. The girl whose missing person flyers Walter posted every month at every post office within 50 miles. The girl whose white bedsheets Ruth changed every week, and whose shampoo she bought every month and kept waiting in the bathroom. Rick stepped away from Colette's door, pulled the half-open door gently closed, softly enough not to wake Nero, but firmly enough to hear the wood touch the frame with a faint whisper, then lifted the phone to his mouth. Find her, Rick said. I'll handle it myself. He hung up and stood alone on the Aldridge family porch at 2 o'clock in the morning, the cold wind from Seneca Lake blowing across his face, and in the darkness behind the door he had just closed, Nero laid his muzzle back on the white shoes and waited, not knowing that the person he was waiting for was being hunted on the orders of the very man who had just closed his room door. 3 days passed after the call with Finch, and Rick still hadn't received any news about the Red Hook witness. On the 7th night since he had knocked on the door of the Aldridge farm, the rain returned to the Finger Lakes heavier than the first time, the kind of November rain so cold that when the water touched your skin, you felt it bite all the way into the bone. Rick sat on the porch in the wooden chair, Walter usually occupied in the mornings, a glass of cheap bourbon in his hand, the kind Ruth kept in the kitchen cabinet for guests, even though this house rarely had any guests, and he stared out into the darkness where the dirt road disappeared into the rain. Inside the house, Walter and Ruth had gone upstairs to sleep at 9 o'clock. The kitchen light was off, and only the hallway light slipped through the screen door, laying a thin yellow strip across the porch floor. Nero lay in his familiar place in front of Colette's room in the hallway, and everything was quiet in the way Rick had begun to grow used to after 7 days here, the heavy quiet of a house waiting for something it didn't know would ever come. Then Nero sprang up. Rick heard claws scraping against the wooden floor inside the house, fast, urgent, and the black mastiff charged toward the screen door hard enough to slam it against the wall, but this time the dog didn't growl. He didn't bark. Instead, there came a sound Rick hadn't heard once in the 7 days he had lived with this animal. A high, trembling whine rising from deep in his throat, desperate and carrying something else, something it took Rick several seconds to recognize. Hope, the cry of a creature recognizing the scent it had waited for through 18 months. Nero rushed off the porch into the rain, 140 pounds of black muscle vanishing into the dark. And Rick stood up sharply, the bourbon glass tilting in his hand. He looked in the direction the dog had run, toward the end of the dirt road, where rain and darkness swallowed everything more than 20 meters beyond the porch. Then he saw her, a figure at the end of the dirt road, small, staggering, moving so slowly she almost seemed to be standing still in the rain. A clear plastic raincoat was torn at the shoulder and elbows, revealing the thin, soaked layer underneath. Dark brown hair clung to her face and neck. On her feet were gray rubber hospital slippers, the soles worn almost flat, the kind hospitals give to admitted patients. the only thing she had on her feet when she broke the lock on the basement bathroom window of the Pittsburgh safe house 3 days earlier, climbed out at 2 o'clock in the morning while Tommy Slade lay drunk and unconscious on the upstairs sofa, took cash from his wallet, and started running. 3 days of hiding on Greyhound buses in the middle of the night, paying cash under no name, sleeping in shelters along the road between Pittsburgh and upstate New York, eating free handouts and drinking tap water from bus station bathrooms, moving slowly because she didn't dare travel one direct route, changing buses 3 times, always sitting in the very last seat near the emergency exit, always keeping a hat low over her face, always looking out the window after every stop to check whether anyone was looking for her. And finally, tonight, those worn hospital slippers touched the dirt road she had walked thousands of times since childhood, and the dog she had given her parents 2 weeks before she vanished was charging toward her through the rain. Nero slammed straight into Colette, but gently, his enormous black head nuzzling into her stomach, whining over and over, his tail whipping from side to side hard enough to fling mud over both of them, and his entire wrinkled 140-pound body shook in a way this dog had never shaken before anyone or anything. Colette dropped to her knees in the mud, her 2 arms wrapped around Nero's neck, her face buried in his soaked black fur, and she cried, not out loud, only her shoulders shook. Ruth's scream tore the rainy night apart from the front steps. "Letty!" She stood there barefoot on the wet porch floor, in a white nightgown, her silver hair fallen loose, her mouth open, both hands reaching toward the figure kneeling in the mud at the end of the dirt road, as if she could pull her daughter home by sheer force of will across 15 meters of rain. Then she ran. Ruth Aldridge, 75 years old, weak lungs, slow legs, ran down the porch steps and into the muddy yard faster than she had moved at any moment in the past 10 years. Walter appeared behind her, rushing out the door so quickly that the oak cane slipped from his hand and struck the porch floor, and he didn't even turn back to pick it up. He ran after his wife into the rain, his feet sliding in the mud, nearly falling on the last step but catching his balance with the instinct of a body that had once jumped from airplanes. He dropped to his knees beside his daughter in the muddy yard, both hands shaking heavily from Parkinson's disease as they wrapped around Colette's shoulders, his wrinkled face pressing into her wet hair, and his voice broke into something that was no longer words. Only the pure sound of a father receiving back what he had refused to believe was lost forever. My girl, I knew it. I knew you'd come home." Rick stood on the porch. The bourbon glass was still in his hand, rainwater falling into it and thinning the liquor without him noticing. He looked at the girl kneeling in the mud inside the arms of her parents and her dog, and he recognized the face from the photographs hanging all over the house for the past 7 days. But more real than the photographs. Thinner, her cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin, her amber eyes carrying the wild look of an animal that had been caged too long, and the small wrist showing beneath the torn raincoat sleeve so thin that Rick could see the blue veins running under the skin. Then Colette looked up. Her eyes moved past Ruth's shoulder and saw Rick on the porch. She froze, her whole body, soft and collapsed inside her parents' arms 1 second before, now went rigid as steel. Her amber eyes widened, her pupils shrinking, and she backed away, pulling Ruth in front of her, her fingers gripping her mother's nightgown like a child hiding behind an adult after seeing a dark shape in the corner of a room. She didn't recognize Rick. She had never seen the face of the man who had ordered her imprisonment, because that man had never appeared, only a voice over the phone, someone Tommy referred to as the boss. But she was afraid with an instinct sharpened by 18 months of captivity, until it activated before thought could form. Strange man, tall, standing above her, eyes she couldn't read. Run. Rick watched her back away, watched the way her fingers clutched her mother's gown, watched the way her body made itself smaller behind the 75-year-old woman who was thinner and weaker than she was, as if that were the last wall between her and the world. And something inside Rick's chest cracked. Not conscience, because he wasn't sure he still had such a thing. Memory. His mother, Maria Valenti. 23 years earlier, a Brooklyn apartment kitchen, his father walking in at midnight after drinking, and Maria backing away exactly like that, pulling 14-year-old Rick in front of her, her fingers gripping her son's shirt, her body shrinking, her eyes wide, the pure instinct of someone used to being hurt trying to protect the one thing that mattered more than herself. Colette Aldridge backed away exactly the way Maria Valenti once had, and Rick Valenti, for the first time in 23 years, stood in his father's place. They brought Colette into the house, changed her wet clothes into the old pajamas Ruth still kept in her bedroom closet, wrapped 2 layers of blankets around her, and sat her on the living room sofa near the fireplace Rick had built up again, before stepping back into the hallway. Nero jumped onto the sofa at once, 140 pounds of solid black weight settling across Colette's legs as if the dog had decided that anyone who wanted to take her away again would have to lift him first. Ruth sat pressed close beside her daughter, her left hand stroking Colette's wet hair without stopping in a slow, steady rhythm like the ticking of a clock, her right hand gripping the girl's small, thin hand beneath the blanket, and she didn't let go for even 1 second from the moment they entered the house until Colette began to speak. Walter sat in the chair across from them, the oak cane resting against the arm because he no longer had the strength to hold it, both hands laid on his knees and trembling harder than usual, Parkinson's disease, and shock together, making his fingers tap against the fabric of his pants over and over in a way he couldn't control. Colette didn't tell the story in one straight line. She told it in pieces, broken and scattered, in the order memory threw them out rather than in the order time had carried them, and between every piece was a long silence no one dared to fill. She told them about Red Hook. That night, she had left Mount Sinai at 2 o'clock in the morning after a 12-hour shift in the emergency department, walked 3 blocks to the subway station as usual, but the last train had already gone, so she changed direction and headed toward the ferry landing through the Old Harbor district. She heard the gunshots before she saw anything. 2 shots, dry and sharp in the night air. And when she turned her head toward the pier, she saw 2 figures fall to the ground and a group of men standing over them. She ran. She thought she had run fast enough and far enough, but someone had seen her. Because the next night, when she opened the door of her apartment in Brooklyn, 2 men were standing outside, and before she could scream, a hand covered her mouth, and everything went black. She told them about Pittsburgh. A basement room, gray concrete walls, 1 small window boarded up from the outside, a white bulb on the ceiling that never turned off, an iron door with the sound of the lock turning every time the guard walked away. Food pushed through the gap beneath the door twice a day, white foam boxes, fast food, no knife, no fork. The guard was large, with a long scar across his left cheekbone, and he almost never spoke. But every time Colette asked why, asked how much longer, asked what she had done wrong, the answer was always the same. The boss decides. Not me. She told them about the marks on the wall. On the first day, she used her fingernail to scratch a small mark into the concrete wall beside the head of the bed, where the light bulb didn't reach, so the guard wouldn't see it. Every morning when she woke up, she scratched another mark. 5 marks made a group, 30 groups made a month, and she counted each day with the exactness that 5 years of medical training had taught her, because data was the thing that kept reason from drifting away. 547 marks. She remembered the exact number because she had touched each mark every night before sleeping the way other people recite prayers. And she kept scratching, day after day, until the very night she escaped. Ruth tightened her grip around her daughter's hand, her voice cracking. How did you survive that, Letty? Colette looked down at the blanket, at her small, thin hand lying inside her mother's, at the tips of her fingers, where the calluses from scratching the wall were still hard and rough, even though she hadn't scratched for 3 weeks. Not because I ran out of hope, she said, her voice low and flat in the way of someone who had held back emotion for so long she no longer knew how to release it. Because I was afraid that if I knew exactly how long I'd been in there, I'd go insane. There are numbers that once you know them, you can't forget them, and I didn't want to carry that number out with me if one day I got out. Ruth cried, not aloud, only tears running down her wrinkled cheeks and falling into the daughter's hair she was still stroking, and she didn't wipe them away, because wiping them meant letting go of Colette, and she wasn't ready for that. Walter sat still. He didn't cry because he had run dry by the 6th month of searching for his daughter, but his face carried something heavier than tears, the anger of a father who knew someone had locked his child in a basement for 18 months and he hadn't been able to do anything. A hard draft swept through the unclosed front door and sent cold air into the living room, and Walter rose to close it. His hand had just touched the knob when Colette shot up from the sofa. The blankets fell. Nero was pushed aside. Her eyes flew wide and wild, her pupils blown open, her whole body rigid as an iron bar, and her breathing changed into short, shallow, desperate bursts, like someone about to suffocate. Don't close the door. Her voice wasn't a scream, but a cry torn from somewhere deeper than her throat, from the place where fear had lived under her skin for 18 months until it had become a reflex faster than thought. Please don't lock the door. Please leave it open. Leave it open. Ruth wrapped both arms around her daughter and pulled her back down, holding Colette's shoulders tightly enough for her to feel that someone real was holding her, but not so tightly that she would feel trapped. Walter stood frozen in the middle of the room, his hand still on the doorknob, his old face breaking open, and the tears he had thought had dried long ago now ran down the deep lines in his cheeks, as if finding their old path again. He let go of the knob. The door stayed open. Cold wind poured in, but no one moved to close it anymore. Nero climbed onto the sofa a second time, pressed himself against Colette, and pushed his enormous black head into her side until her breathing slowed beat by beat by beat, clinging to the dog's warm fur, as if it were the only thing in this house that 18 months of captivity hadn't managed to take from her memory. Out in the hallway, 4 steps from the living room, Rick Valenti stood with his back against the wall, his eyes closed, both hands hanging at his sides, and heard everything, every word, every sob, every sharp breath when the door nearly closed, and the number, 547 scratches on the concrete wall of the Pittsburgh basement, a number he himself had created with 4 words spoken over a phone and then forgotten. Rick waited until the crying in the living room had quieted into the steady breathing of people, exhausted by emotion, before he moved away from the hallway wall, where he had stood motionless the entire time Colette told her story. He stepped into the downstairs bathroom, closed the door, and turned the lock. The sound of the lock clicking echoed in the small space, and Rick stood still for 1 second, looking at his fingers on the latch, recognizing the irony without anyone needing to point it out. He had just locked himself inside a small room with a door that locked from the inside, a privilege Colette Aldridge hadn't had for 547 days. He took out his phone and called Finch. "The Red Hook witness," Rick said, his voice low. "I need her real name." There was a brief silence on the other end, the sound of keys typing. Then Finch's voice returned with the professional calm he always kept when reading classified information. "Colette Aldridge, emergency department nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital, Manhattan, 27 years old. Missing since May 14th. Schuyler County Police File. Lead Detective Owen Briggs, closed after 6 months for insufficient evidence. Father, Walter Aldridge, 79 years old. Mother, Ruth Aldridge, 75 years old. Address, farm by Seneca Lake, Watkins Glen, Finger Lakes, New York." Finch paused. "That's the family you're staying with, isn't it, Rick?" A long silence followed. The kind of silence Finch had heard from Rick hundreds of times in 15 years. But this time, there was something different inside it. Not the cold calculation Rick usually had when weighing his next move, but something heavier, slower, like a machine running smoothly until it suddenly encountered something it hadn't been programmed to process. "Cancel the search order," Rick said. "Rick, she's the only witness to the Red Hook job. If she talks to the feds, the entire Brooklyn line collapses. 6 of our people go to prison, and the FBI has enough ground to reopen 7 cases we buried. You understand that?" I said cancel it. Rick's voice wasn't cold. Finch recognized that immediately because he had heard Rick's voice long enough to know every shade of it. Rick's voice when ordering a killing was cold and even. Rick's voice when negotiating was soft and slow. Rick's voice when angry was low and sharp. But Finch had never heard this voice before. It wasn't cold, wasn't soft, wasn't sharp. It was tired. Tired in the way of men who have been running for too long without looking back. Until one day they stop and see everything they left behind, and the weight of all of it falls onto their shoulders at once. "What's happening over there, Rick?" Finch asked. Rick hung up. He stood in the Aldridge family's small bathroom, his back against the locked door, the phone clenched in his hand but hanging at his side. The bathroom light was off, with only moonlight slipping through the small high window, casting a silver streak across the old sink and the white plastic shelf mounted on the wall beside it. On that shelf, between Walter's toothbrush and Ruth's jar of skin cream, sat an unopened green bottle of shampoo. Rick looked at the bottle, a cheap brand, the kind sold in a small grocery store or a roadside gas station, mint-scented. Ruth bought this bottle every month and placed it on the bathroom shelf beside her and her husband's things, ready for the day her daughter walked into the bathroom and needed to wash her hair after a long trip home. 18 bottles in 18 months, each bottle replaced when it expired, and Ruth never stopped buying it, because to stop buying it would mean admitting Colette wasn't coming back. Rick picked up the shampoo bottle, opened the cap. The The scent of mint filled the tight bathroom air, and Rick stood there breathing it in without realizing he was breathing until the scent touched someplace deep in his brain that he had locked away 23 years ago. Mint, the corner grocery at Sackett and Court in Brooklyn. The bottom shelf on the right, the cheapest bottle of shampoo in the store. The brand no one bought except people who couldn't afford anything else. His mother bought that bottle every month. Maria Valenti, the small woman with black hair who liked to sing O Sole Mio in the kitchen, used cheap mint shampoo because it was the only thing she bought for herself in a life where everything else belonged to fear and endurance. Rick remembered the smell of his mother's hair when she held him before bedtime. Mint. And then one night, she stopped holding him because she fell down the stairs and never got back up, and the smell of mint vanished from the Brooklyn apartment at the same time her singing did. Rick placed the shampoo bottle back on the shelf, exactly where it had been. He looked into the mirror above the sink, looked at his face in the moonlight, at the gray-blue eyes everyone in the underworld had learned to fear, and for the first time in many years, he didn't recognize the man looking back at him. The rule said, eliminate the witness, or at least lock her away again, protect the empire at any cost. For 15 years, he had lived by that rule, and it had never been wrong. But the rule didn't smell like mint. The rule didn't have 547 scratches on a wall. The rule didn't have a dog waiting 18 months on white shoes. And the rule didn't have the sound of a 27-year-old girl begging them not to lock the door in her parents' living room because he was the one who had taught her to fear the sound of a lock. The next day, Colette didn't come out of her room until almost noon, and when she appeared at the kitchen doorway, the first thing she did wasn't look at Ruth or Walter, but sweep her eyes across the room in a way Rick recognized instantly, because it was exactly the way he swept a room every time he entered a new space. Where the doors were, whether the windows were open, who was sitting where, who was holding what, and which direction held the nearest exit. 18 months in a locked room hadn't destroyed Colette Aldridge. It had turned her into something else. Someone who read a room before sitting down, read people before speaking, and trusted instinct more than words, because words were what Tommy Slade used every time he said, "The boss will let you go soon," while the lock kept turning every night. Colette didn't trust Rick. That was clear in every movement she made in the same room with him, always keeping at least an arm's length between them, always standing closer to the door than to him, always letting Nero lie between them like a living wall of fur and muscle. She noticed details Walter and Ruth either didn't see or didn't know how to read. The way Rick always sat with his back to the wall no matter where he was in the house, never turning his back to a door, the habit of someone used to being attacked from behind, or used to attacking others and knowing they would do the same to him. The thick callus on his right index finger that she saw when he held his coffee cup, the kind of callus an emergency nurse in Manhattan knew well, because she had seen it on the hands of enough men pushed into the emergency room at midnight with bullet wounds in their bodies. And those gray-blue eyes that never warmed, even when his mouth smiled at Ruth as she brought out tea, even when he nodded to Walter on the porch. His eyes still calculated, still measured, still kept a pane of glass between himself and the world. And Colette recognized that because she had seen eyes like that through the crack of the Pittsburgh basement door every time Tommy checked on her, the eyes of someone who saw human beings as objects, not lives. But there was one thing Colette didn't understand. Nero no longer growled at Rick. The dog still watched him, still turned his head every time Rick passed by, but the growling had stopped on the third or fourth day, and now Nero treated Rick with something almost like acceptance, though not yet trust. Colette took note of this without commenting, because she didn't know what it meant yet, but she trusted Nero more than she trusted herself when it came to judging people, because the dog wasn't fooled by voices or smiles. That afternoon, Ruth and Walter went upstairs to rest, exhausted from the night before, and Colette stayed alone in the kitchen with Rick for the first time. She leaned against the sink, both hands around a cup of tea, and looked straight into his eyes in a way not many people in the world dared to do with Hendrik Valenti. "Who are you, really?" she asked, her voice calm, but each word placed down clearly. Rick set his coffee cup on the table. "The man helping your parents get rid of the person threatening them." Colette didn't blink. Good men don't have bullet wounds in their ribs. Silence stretched for 3 breaths between them. And in that silence, Rick looked at Colette. Truly looked. Not at a witness. Not at a problem to be handled. But at a human being standing in front of him with a cup of tea trembling slightly in her hands and amber eyes that refused to lower. "You should rest," Rick said. "You should tell the truth," Colette replied, then walked out of the kitchen with her teacup and didn't look back. That night, Rick couldn't sleep again, and he went out to the porch and sat in the familiar wooden chair. No bourbon this time, only darkness and the wind from Seneca Lake. He had been sitting there for about 10 minutes when the screen door opened and Colette stepped out, barefoot. A thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes shadowed like someone an old nightmare had just shaken awake. She saw Rick, stopped for 1 second, then sat down in the chair at the far end of the porch without saying anything, without turning back inside, as if she had decided that the cold air on the porch with a stranger she didn't trust was still better than the darkness in her bedroom, with a door she didn't dare close. Nero followed her onto the porch and lay down exactly between them, his enormous black head resting on Colette's feet, his long tail stretching back until it touched the leg of Rick's chair, and the dog lay there like the only bridge between two shores. They sat in the dark for a long time. 10 minutes. Maybe 15. The wind pushed rotting leaves across the yard. Seneca Lake reflected the crescent moon in a thin silver streak between the black shapes of the hills. Then Colette spoke, not looking at Rick, her eyes fixed on the lake. In the 12th month, I stopped counting. I already told my parents that. But I didn't tell them everything. I stopped because by then I realized I was counting days to live, but I was also counting days to die. And those two things were starting to look too much alike, so I had to stop before I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Rick didn't answer right away. He sat still long enough for Colette to think he wouldn't say anything, and she didn't expect him to, because she hadn't told him so he would comfort her. She told him because the darkness on her own porch was safer than the darkness inside her head. And sometimes saying things to a stranger was easier than saying them to family, because family would hurt and a stranger would forget. But Rick spoke. His voice was lower than usual, his eyes on the lake, not on Colette. My mother was locked in her bedroom every night for 10 years. My father locked the door from the outside after he drank, and my mother didn't scream, didn't pound on the door, didn't beg. She sang, softly, just enough for me to hear through the wall of the room next door. Italian songs she had learned from my grandmother in Palermo. She sang every night, and I lay there listening every night. And that was how the two of us told each other we had both survived one more night. He stopped. The wind from the lake swept across the porch, cold enough to make their breath visible, but no one went inside to get another coat. When she stopped singing, Rick said, she stopped living too. It was the first time in 23 years that Rick had spoken about Maria Valenti to anyone but himself, and he didn't know why he had said it to Colette Aldridge on her parents' porch at 2 o'clock in the morning, the daughter he himself had kept locked away for 18 months. But he had said it, and he couldn't take it back. The two of them sat at opposite ends of the porch, not looking at each other, both of them staring out at the black, silent surface of Seneca Lake in the night, and between them, Nero breathed steadily, his head on one person's feet, his tail touching the other's chair, binding two sleepless people, with the only thread neither of them was ready to name. The next morning, Rick was standing on the porch, watching Colette sit by the lakeshore with Nero, when his phone vibrated. Finch, and his voice carried an urgency Rick rarely heard, because Finch Calloway was the kind of man who spoke more slowly when everything around him sped up, unless the situation had already gone beyond what slowness could handle. Tommy didn't obey the cancellation order, Finch said. He hasn't taken my calls since yesterday. I sent people to check, and the Pittsburgh safe house is empty. Tommy disappeared with his car and his gun. He's afraid of being punished for letting the witness escape, so he went looking for her himself before you found out. He checked the Mount Sinai personnel file and got her permanent address and hometown. He knows Finger Lakes, Rick. Rick tightened his grip on the wooden porch rail. How long? Pittsburgh to Finger Lakes is about 5 hours by car. If he left last night, he could get there sometime today. I've sent 2 men to block the route on Interstate 86, but Tommy knows the rural shortcuts better than we do because he grew up in the Allegheny region. Silence. Rick looked toward the lakeshore, where Colette sat on a flat stone, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, one hand resting on Nero's head, her eyes fixed on the gray water. From this distance, she looked even smaller than her thinness allowed. Small in the way someone who has just escaped a locked room sees the outside world as too wide, too bright, too much, and folds herself down to fit the space she had grown used to for 18 months. Prepare for the worst, Finch said. Rick hung up and stood on the Aldridge porch in the November morning wind, and for the first time in many years, he was in a position where the sharpest strategic mind in the East Coast underworld couldn't produce a clean answer. His own hired man was driving toward this farm to kill a girl Rick himself had ordered imprisoned. And that girl was now sitting by the lake 30 meters away, with a black dog resting its head on her lap, and Rick wanted to protect her. Protect. The word felt strange inside his head. Strange in the way a familiar tool suddenly feels when held in the wrong hand, and Rick didn't know why. He turned the word protect over and over in his mind, like a card he didn't remember drawing, searching for the strategic calculation behind it, searching for the benefit, searching for the angle by which this decision served the Valenti Empire, and he found nothing. No benefit, no strategy, only the smell of mint in the bathroom, the scream begging them not to close the door. 547 scratches on a wall, and a 27-year-old girl staring at the lake with the same eyes Rick had seen in his own mother's mirror 23 years earlier. Rick Valenti had lived 37 years without fearing anything. Not bullets, not the FBI, not rival families, not prison, not death. But this morning, standing on the Aldridge porch watching Colette sit by the lake while Tommy Slade was driving toward her with a gun and an order Rick himself had given, he was afraid. Not afraid of Tommy, afraid of the thing happening inside his own chest. The thing he couldn't name and couldn't control. Because Hendrik Valenti had built an entire empire on the foundation of absolute control, and whatever he couldn't control could destroy him. Tommy came at night. The rain returned to the Finger Lakes for the third time that week, as if the November weather had decided the small house beside Seneca Lake hadn't endured enough, and Nero was the first to know. The black mastiff had been lying in the middle of the living room near Colette's feet on the sofa, when he suddenly sprang up with the most violent reaction he had shown since the night Rick knocked on the farmhouse door 8 days earlier. It wasn't the guarding growl he had given Rick, wasn't the angry barking he had given Price, but a continuous, tearing bark, each sound pounding out of his chest like a hammer striking the floor, his entire black body, lowering close to the ground in an attack stance. The dog had never once used inside the house. Rick shot up from the kitchen chair before the second bark ended. 15 years in the underworld hadn't taught him many good things, but it had taught him one thing that was never wrong. When instinct says run or fight, don't stop to ask why. He turned to Walter, who was standing at the living room door with the oak cane in his hand, and spoke in a voice he hadn't used in this house since he arrived. A short, sharp voice with no room for questions or hesitation, the voice of a man used to giving orders in situations where every second had value. Take Ruth and Colette into the back room. Lock the door. Don't open it until I say so. Walter looked at Rick for 2 seconds. Those 2 seconds were enough for the 79-year-old veteran of the 101st Airborne Division to see what he had suspected since the first night, but had never confirmed. The man standing in front of him wasn't a real estate investor, wasn't the victim of a car accident, wasn't a kind stranger passing through. He was something far more dangerous, something Walter had seen in war among certain commanders, the kind of danger that was systematic, organized, and controlled. But Walter saw something else in those 2 seconds, too. Rick was standing between his family and the front door, facing outward, with his back turned inward. And whatever he was, that stance meant only one thing. He was standing on Walter's side, not on the side of whoever was outside. For now, that was enough. Walter nodded, turned, and led a trembling Ruth and wide-eyed Colette, along with Nero, into the downstairs bedroom. Rick stepped out onto the porch. He carried no weapon, though he knew Tommy Slade always carried a gun, and knew Tommy was in the most dangerous state a stupid, frightened man could be in, the kind of man who shoots first and thinks afterward. Rick carried no weapon because he didn't need one. In Hendrik Valenti's world, his presence was a weapon, his voice was a weapon, and the Valenti name weighed more than any gun Tommy Slade could tuck into the back of his waistband. Rain lashed Rick's face as he stepped through the screen door and looked out across the front yard. A rented sedan sat crooked on the dirt road, its headlights off, the driver's door open. Tommy Slade stood beside the car, 34 years old, large built, the long scar across his left cheekbone white under the rain, and in his right hand he held a pistol pointed toward the ground, but his finger was already on the trigger. Tommy saw Rick step out onto the porch and froze. His face changed from tension to panic in one flat second, his mouth opening and then closing, and his eyes jumping from Rick to the house and back to Rick, as if his mind were trying to force together 2 pieces of information that couldn't fit, the boss and the witness's farm. "Boss?" Tommy said, his voice breaking inside the word. "You're here?" Rick walked down the porch steps, slowly, every step even on the wet wood, his gray-blue eyes never leaving Tommy. "Go home, Tommy." "But the witness," Tommy stammered, rainwater running down the scar on his face. "She's here, right?" "I checked the file, the hometown address. This is the place. I have to fix this before. I know I messed up, but I can fix it. If she's in there, I'll handle it and everything will be all right, boss. I swear everything will be all right." Rick stopped 5 paces from Tommy. Rain poured between them. "Take one more step toward this house," Rick said, his voice so low Tommy had to lean forward to hear him through the rain. "And you won't take another step for the rest of your life." Tommy looked into Rick's eyes. And whatever Tommy saw there, something he had seen enough times in 10 years serving the Valenti family to know it wasn't a threat, but a promise, made him step back once, then twice, then turn, get into the car, close the door, and drive away into the rain without looking back. The red taillights blurred along the dirt road, then disappeared. Rick stood in the yard under the rain for another 10 seconds before turning back toward the house. And when he stepped through the screen door into the living room, rainwater running from his hair and clothes to form a puddle on the wooden floor, Colette was standing there, not in the downstairs bedroom where Walter had taken her, standing behind the half-open kitchen door, her face white, her hand gripping the doorframe, her amber eyes wide. She had heard everything through the thin door. Every word. The witness. Boss. She's in there. And when Rick looked into Colette's eyes then, he knew Tommy Slade wasn't the one who had caused the greatest damage that night. Colette stepped out from behind the kitchen door into the middle of the living room and stopped there, her right hand gripping the back of the wooden chair so tightly that her knuckles turned bloodless white, and she looked at Rick with amber eyes that 8 days ago had been only a face in photographs on the walls, but were now alive and burning with something stronger than fear. Nero moved at once, 140 pounds of black muscle sliding across the wooden floor to stand pressed against Colette's side. And for the first time since the early days after Rick entered this house, the low, heavy growl returned, rumbling from the dog's chest straight toward Rick, clear and final, as if the animal had finally confirmed what it had smelled on the first night but hadn't yet had proof to name. "You," Colette said. One word. But that word carried 18 months in a locked room, 547 marks on the wall, food shoved through a gap beneath the door, and the sentence, "The boss decides," that she had heard hundreds of times from the guard's mouth. "You're the boss." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Walter appeared at the living room entrance, Ruth behind him, both of them hurrying down when they heard Nero growling again. Walter looked at Colette first, saw his daughter's bloodless face, and the way her hand gripped the chair until it trembled, then looked at Rick, standing by the front door with rain still streaming from his hair onto the floor, then looked back at Colette, then at Rick again. And in the 2 seconds between those looks, everything he had built over the past 8 days, the trust, the gratitude, the family dinner, the bourbon on the porch, the empty chair that wasn't empty anymore, all of it collapsed across his face, the way Rick had seen controlled demolitions collapse buildings. There was no roar, no flying dust, just the entire structure slowly folding inward on itself until nothing remained standing. Ruth's knees buckled, and she caught herself on the living room doorway, her left hand clutching the edge of the pale blue sweater Colette had given her, and her mouth opened, but no sound came out, only short, shallow breaths and pale blue eyes filling with water in a single second. Colette let go of the chair. She took 1 step forward. Only 1 step. But that step brought her out from behind the chair into the open space of the living room, where nothing stood between her and Rick, except 3 meters of wooden floor, and Nero growling low. And she looked straight into his eyes. Tears ran down her face, but her voice didn't shake. Every word rang clearly in the small living room, set down one by one like bricks in a wall no one could tear down. "You took 18 months of my life. You locked me in a basement like an animal, and never even bothered to ask my name. You made my parents think I was dead. You let my mother buy shampoo every month for a daughter you knew exactly where to find. You let my father put up flyers all over the county for the child you were hiding." She stopped to take one breath, and the whole room heard it. "You sat at my mother's table, drank the coffee my father made, slept in our house, sat in my chair." Her voice still didn't shake, but the tears fell faster. "While you knew you were the reason I disappeared. And now you order your man not to kill me as if that's mercy. As if I should thank you because you decided to let me live." The living room went completely silent. The rain outside the door, Nero's steady growl, Ruth's quick breathing as she held the doorframe. Nothing else. Walter stepped forward. The oak cane was in his right hand, that hand shaking heavily from Parkinson's disease but gripping so hard that blue veins rose along the back of it. And he walked past Colette, past Nero, and stood in front of Rick, close enough that he had to lift his head to look into the eyes of the man who was in the full, formidable prime of his youth, almost a head taller, stronger than him in every way a body could be measured. 79 years old, Parkinson's disease, thin and frail, but the gray-blue eyes of the old soldier burned with something neither war nor age had ever managed to put out. "Get out of the house where my daughter is." Walter's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Each word was heavy enough to fall on its own. Rick stood still. He didn't step back, didn't look away, didn't lift his hands, didn't open his mouth to defend himself or explain or apologize, because in that moment, he understood that no words in the world were large enough to cover what everyone in that room had just seen, and any attempt would only be another insult. He said only one sentence, his voice low, not asking, not expecting anything in return. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'll fix what I broke." Colette looked at him. Tears still ran down her face, but her eyes were harder than steel. "Get out of my parents' house." Rick nodded once, turned, walked out the front door into the November rain without taking anything except the clothes on his body and the phone in his pocket, and the screen door closed behind him with a soft cry. Nero stepped out onto the porch. The black mastiff stood at the edge of the wooden boards, rain splashing into his fur. But he didn't retreat inside, and he watched Rick cross the muddy yard toward the pickup truck parked outside the gate. He didn't growl, didn't bark, only watched with silent amber eyes, and Rick felt that stare on his back heavier than every bullet that had ever passed through his body. Because bullets only tore flesh, but the dog's eyes tore something deeper, something Rick hadn't known he still had until it began to bleed. Rick drove the pickup through the rain for 15 minutes into the town of Watkins Glen, and stopped in front of a small motel on Main Street, the kind of 2-story motel with faded exterior paint where guests could pay cash without papers, and the owner didn't ask for real names. The ground floor room he received a key for was the complete opposite of every place Rick had slept in for the past 15 years. A single bed with a sagging mattress, yellowed walls stained with damp mold, a rusty bathroom faucet dripping steadily into a cracked porcelain sink, and curtains so thin that the parking lot light outside shone straight into the room. Rick sat on the edge of the bed, still in his wet suit, rainwater still dripping from his hair onto the old carpet, and stared at the wall across from him without seeing anything. Then he took out his phone and called Finch. This time, he didn't speak quickly. He spoke slowly, sentence by sentence, clearly, the way a man speaks after thinking carefully before making the call. Not because he was hesitating, but because every sentence he was about to say would destroy another part of the empire he had spent 15 years building, and he wanted to make sure Finch recorded every word. "First," Rick said, "turn Tommy Slade over to the FBI. Contact the FBI field office in Western New York, in Buffalo, and send them anonymously every piece of evidence connected to Colette Aldridge's kidnapping, the Pittsburgh safe house address, the guard shift records, the food purchase receipts Tommy paid for with his debit card, and the recording of the call between Tommy and our internal line on the night of May 14th. Finch was silent on the other end. Rick knew he was calculating, because Rick was calculating too. The evidence delivered to the FBI would lead straight to Tommy. Tommy's confession would lead to the Brooklyn line. The Brooklyn line would lead back to the Valenti family. And the Valenti family was Rick. He was tying the noose around his own neck and handing the other end to the federal government. Second, transfer the full financial records of Lakeview Capital Partners, every land transaction in the Finger Lakes, and the evidence that Gordon Price sabotaged the Aldridge farm, including photographs of the smashed water pipe, the threatening letters, neighboring witnesses, to Detective Owen Briggs of Schuyler County through an anonymous channel. Briggs handled Colette's missing person file. He'll know how to connect the pieces. Third, set up an anonymous trust. Money from my personal account in Switzerland, not family money. Pay every medical debt Ruth Aldridge owes to Schuyler Hospital and the Ithaca Clinic. Pay the farm's property taxes for 5 years. Hire a crew to repair the entire heating system, plumbing, and roof. My name doesn't appear anywhere on any document. A long silence followed on the other end of the line. Rick heard Finch breathing, slow and heavy, the breath of a man weighing every word he was about to say. "You're burning 15 years, Rick." Everything you built since the day you killed your father. The Brooklyn line, the Atlantic City casinos, the Jersey money laundering network, the real estate projects, all of it. Tommy only has to say one thing, and the FBI has enough ground to reopen 7 cases we buried. You understand that, don't you? Rick stood from the bed, walked to the window, and pulled the thin curtain aside. Outside, the eastern sky was turning from black to gray, the first dawn he had seen from outside the Aldridge house in more than a week, and in the distance, Seneca Lake began to appear like a silver-gray mirror between the mist-blurred hills. I built the wrong thing, Finch. Another silence. Then Finch spoke, his voice softer. Soft in the way Rick had only heard from him once before, on the day of Maria's funeral 23 years earlier, when Finch had placed a hand on 14-year-old Rick's shoulder as he stood before his mother's coffin and said nothing. Maria would be proud. Rick closed his eyes, opened them, hung up. The machine began running in reverse. Within 2 weeks, Tommy Slade was arrested by the FBI at a motel in Altoona, Pennsylvania, based on anonymous evidence so detailed that the lead agent told a colleague, "Someone inside the organization wants this guy sunk." Tommy talked, not because he was brave, but because when the FBI placed in front of him photographs of the Pittsburgh safe house, photographs of the basement room, photographs of the concrete wall with 547 scratches that the forensic team had numbered and photographed one by one, he understood that the only person who could provide evidence that detailed was his boss, and if his boss had decided to burn him, no lawyer on earth could save him. Gordon Price was arrested at the Lakeview Capitol office in Rochester 2 days after Tommy, the search warrant 43 pages long, listing every fraudulent land transaction, every act of property sabotage, every threatening letter, and every call with partners Price thought no one had recorded, though Finch had recorded them from the first day because Finch recorded everything. Detective Owen Briggs reopened the Colette Aldridge file, the file whose copy he had kept in his private drawer for 12 months while waiting for the day there would be enough evidence. And now he had more than enough. Colette Aldridge was officially reclassified. Federal kidnapping victim. Not a voluntary missing person. Not a closed file. The FBI opened a federal interstate investigation from New York to Pennsylvania, and the name Valenti began appearing in internal reports as a connection no one yet had enough evidence to pull. But the thread was visible now. Rick sat in the Watkins Glen motel reading update messages from Finch on his phone, line by line, and each line was another piece of the 15-year empire breaking apart. He set the phone down, looked out the window where Seneca Lake glittered beneath the morning sun, and for the first time in Hendrik Valenti's life, he had no power, no empire, no army, no way back, only a cheap motel room, a healing bullet wound in his ribs, and the memory of 547 scratches on the wall he himself had created. Rick didn't return to the farm. He didn't call, didn't send a message, didn't write a letter, didn't ask Finch to pass along a word, didn't do anything a man trying to buy forgiveness with language would do. But every Saturday morning at 5 o'clock, while the sky was still dark and mist from Seneca Lake lay thick over the dirt road, the old pickup truck stopped outside the gate of the Aldridge farm, and Rick stepped down. No suit. A gray plaid flannel shirt, old jeans, work boots, the hand that had once signed death orders now holding an axe to split firewood. He unloaded already split oak from the truck bed, stacked it neatly in front of the porch, exactly where Walter always kept the wood, then got back in the truck and drove away before the kitchen light came on. No knock at the door, no note left behind, only oak wood. Every Tuesday, Ruth's prescriptions were delivered to the farm door by the pharmacy in Watkins Glen, fully paid. And when Ruth asked who had paid, the pharmacist only said, "An anonymous account, ma'am." The western fence of the farm, the one Walter had wanted to replace for 2 years but couldn't afford, was replaced with new cedar in a single night by a crew that arrived after Walter and Ruth had gone to sleep and left before they woke. The dirt road leading into the farm, the one that turned to mud every time it rained, was covered with smooth gravel. The heating system in the house was repaired by a crew that came one afternoon, and when Ruth opened the door, 3 workers said, "We were hired to fix it. It's already been paid for," and couldn't answer when she asked who had hired them. Rick didn't explain, because explaining meant using words, and words were what he had used to deceive this family for 8 days, so he no longer had the right to use them. He only acted. Every Saturday, 5 o'clock in the morning, Oakwood. Nero was the first in the Aldridge family to respond. Starting on the second Saturday, The black mastiff began running out to the porch whenever he heard the pickup at dawn, his tail giving a small wag as he stood at the edge of the porch watching Rick unload the wood without growling, without barking, only watching with calm amber eyes before turning back into the house when the truck drove away. Colette watched from the window of her upstairs room. She didn't come down, didn't wave, didn't open the door. But every Saturday, she stood behind the white curtain and looked down into the front yard, where Rick in flannel carried wood through the early mist, and she registered one thing that 18 months of reading people from inside a locked room had taught her to recognize. The man carrying wood down there wasn't performing. There was no audience for him to perform for, because he didn't know she was watching, and manipulators only perform when someone is there to see. 3 weeks after Rick left the farm, Walter went to buy hinges at the Watkins Glen hardware store and saw Rick standing at the checkout counter with a box of oak. The two men looked at each other in the narrow aisle, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and paint, and Walter was the one who spoke first. He spoke slowly, word by word, looking Rick straight in the eye the way he looked everyone straight in the eye, because 79 years of living had taught him that anyone who couldn't look straight back wasn't worth hearing. "I don't forgive you," Walter said. "Maybe I never will." Rick nodded. No argument, no explanation, no plea. "But Detective Briggs called me," Walter continued. "Letty's file has been reopened. The man who guarded her has been arrested. And whoever sent Briggs the evidence, Briggs says he doesn't know who it was. But I know, because there aren't many people in this world who know about Red Hook, Lakeview Capital, and the Pittsburgh Safe House all at once." Walter looked at the box of oak on the checkout counter. "It takes more than oak wood to repay 18 months, but at least you're counting in the right direction." Then he turned and walked away without another word, and Rick watched him until the old man disappeared beyond the glass front door before he lifted the box of wood and stepped out into the parking lot. 1 month after the night Rick walked out into the rain, Colette appeared at the motel. Rick opened the room door when he heard the knock at noon and found her standing in the first-floor hallway, her brown hair tied loosely behind her, wearing the old denim jacket from her room at the farm, holding a plastic lunch container. "My mother made me bring this," Colette said, her voice calm, her eyes straight on his. "It wasn't my idea." Rick looked at the container, looked at Colette, and for the first time since the night he had left the farm, the corner of his mouth moved in something almost like a smile, though not quite a smile. "You're terrible at lying." Colette almost laughed, then held it back, then got angry at herself for almost laughing in front of the man who had locked her away for 18 months. But she didn't leave. They sat on the first-floor motel balcony, looking out over the parking lot and beyond it to Seneca Lake, glittering under the early winter sun, eating the food Ruth had packed in the plastic container, and they stayed quiet for a long time before Colette spoke. She asked about Maria. Not out of politeness, not to comfort him, but the way an emergency department nurse asks a patient a question, directly, without circling around it, because she had heard Rick mention his mother on the porch that night, and she knew the wounds people hide most carefully are usually the ones still infected. Rick told her more than he had that night on the porch. He told her about the Brooklyn apartment, the sound of O Sole Mio through the wall, the basil his mother grew on the windowsill, and the night the singing stopped, and 14-year-old Rick lay on the other side of the wall waiting and waiting, hearing nothing but a silence thicker than any wall. He told her about his father standing before his mother's coffin, with a grieving face the whole neighborhood knew was fake, though no one said it. He told her about killing his father 8 years later, with the same gun his father had used to threaten his mother, and how the only thing he felt then wasn't fear or remorse, but emptiness, the kind of emptiness he filled with power over the next 15 years, until power became the only thing he had, and the only thing he knew how to use. Colette listened, looked out over the lake, then said one sentence Rick would remember longer than any bullet that had ever passed through his body. "You didn't hit women like your father. You only locked them in rooms and forgot they existed. You became a different version of your father without realizing it." Rick didn't deny it. He sat still on the balcony of the cheap motel, looking at Seneca Lake with Ruth's lunch container in his hands, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say when the truth had been placed on the table by the only person in the world with the right to say it. 2 weeks after that noon on the motel balcony, Finch called Rick at midnight, with news Rick had expected, but had still hoped wouldn't come. Gordon Price had been granted bail. The most expensive lawyer in Rochester wasn't enough to explain that, because Price no longer had that kind of money after the Lakeview Capital accounts were frozen. But the rival, Valenti family on the East Coast The people who had ambushed Rick on Route 17 the night he drove to the Finger Lakes did have that kind of money, and they had a reason to use it. Price was the knife they could hold to stab Rick where he was most vulnerable, and now the entire East Coast underworld knew exactly where that place was, because news travels fast in the dark. The Valenti boss was protecting an old family in the Finger Lakes, and anyone who wanted to hurt Rick only had to hurt them. It happened on a Wednesday night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, when the Aldridge farm was sunk in darkness and the whole family was asleep except Nero. The black mastiff was lying in his familiar place in front of Colette's room when he suddenly lifted his head, ears pressed back, and charged toward the front door with a speed that 140 pounds of muscle shouldn't have had at 2 o'clock in the morning. A dark figure was prying at the back kitchen door when Nero burst through the front porch screen door, tearing through the mesh, circled the house, and slammed straight into the intruder. A shout, Nero's growl, then the dog's cry of pain, high and sharp, slicing through the still night. And when Colette rushed down the stairs and out onto the back porch, Nero was lying on the front porch boards. The intruder had vanished into the darkness, and black blood was spreading from the dog's left shoulder across the white wooden planks Rick had replaced 2 months earlier. Colette dropped to her knees. 18 months in a locked room hadn't erased 5 years of medical training, and the instinct of an emergency nurse flared up instantly. Stronger than fear, stronger than nightmares, stronger than everything Pittsburgh had done to her. Both of her hands pressed against the wound on Nero's shoulder, hot blood surging through her fingers, and her voice rang through the night, sharp and clean, as if she were standing in the emergency department at Mount Sinai. "Dad, bring clean towels down here. Any towels. Hurry." Walter rushed down the stairs with a stack of kitchen towels in his hands. Ruth followed behind him, her face white, one hand gripping the railing. Colette wrapped the towels around Nero's shoulder, kept the pressure steady, and the dog lay still beneath her hands, whining softly, amber eyes fixed on her face, with the absolute trust of a creature who knew the hand. Keeping him alive was the hand he had waited for through 18 months. Then Colette pulled out her phone. She dialed a number she didn't know when she had saved, maybe when Ruth had read Rick's number aloud to her a few weeks earlier, and she had entered it without telling anyone. It was the first time she had called Rick on her own since learning who he was, and her voice on the phone was calm enough to be frightening, the calm of an emergency nurse used to keeping someone alive while everything around her collapsed. "They stabbed Nero. Come here, right now." Rick arrived in 15 minutes. Not from the Watkins Glen Motel, but from the small cabin he had rented 10 minutes from the farm weeks earlier, closer than anyone in the Aldridge family knew, because Rick had never truly gone far away, even though he never stepped close again. Finch was in the passenger seat. The veterinarian from Ithaca, whom Finch had called on the drive, sat in the back with a surgical kit. Nero was saved on the Aldridge kitchen floor at 3 o'clock in the morning under the yellow light. The veterinarian stitched the stab wound in his shoulder, injected antibiotics, wrapped the bandage, and said, "This dog is stronger than most of my human patients. He'll be all right." The whole time the doctor worked, Nero lay still on the wooden floor, his wrinkled black muzzle resting on Rick's thigh. Not Colette's thigh, not Walter's or Ruth's, Rick's. The dog who had growled without stopping the first night Rick crossed the threshold now rested his head on Rick's thigh in his worst pain, his tail thumping once softly against the wooden floor when Rick laid a hand on his head, and his amber eyes closed with a trust no lie could buy. Rick sat on the Aldridge kitchen floor, his back against the wooden cabinet, his hands covered in Nero's blood, his flannel shirt dirty, his face more tired than it had been at any moment since he first knocked on the farm door in the rainy night, 8 weeks earlier. Walter stood on the stairs looking down. He watched that scene for a long time, the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast, sitting on his kitchen floor, his hands full of his daughter's dog's blood, keeping the animal alive through the night, while a doctor stitched the wound beneath the kitchen light. Walter said nothing, but he wasn't holding the oak cane this time. 2 days later, Rick drove back to Manhattan for the first time in more than 2 months. He called a meeting with the families in the private room of the Italian restaurant in Little Italy, on the same street where his mother used to buy mint shampoo, and laid on the table every piece of evidence showing that Gordon Price had worked with the rival family to betray the alliance. In the mafia world, betraying an alliance carried more weight than murder, and the families agreed to deal with Price under the rules of the underground without Rick needing to touch him. But agreement came with a price. Rick had to surrender most of the criminal operations to the other families. The Brooklyn Line, the Atlantic City casinos, the Jersey money laundering network, The Valenti empire he had spent 15 years building shrank into a small part of itself. Finch drove Rick back to the Finger Lakes that night, and as they passed through Brooklyn, Rick looked out the car window and saw the corner grocery at Sackett and Court, still lit at 11 o'clock at night, and he wondered whether the bottom shelf on the right still carried the cheapest bottle of mint shampoo in the store. 6 months after the night Nero was stabbed on the porch, spring returned to the Finger Lakes the way spring always returned to this land. Slowly, patiently, without hurry, as if winter, no matter how long it stayed, was only a tenant, while warmth and sunlight were the true owners of the house. The vineyard hills on both sides of the road into Watkins Glen turned green again, the first new shoots rising from the wooden trellises that had stood dry all winter, and Seneca Lake reflected the clear May sky so perfectly that from the porch of the Aldridge farm, a person could hardly tell where the water ended and where the sky began. The farm came back to life. Not loudly, not brightly, but in the way houses that have endured too much for too long come back to life when someone finally begins caring for them again. A fresh coat of white paint on the outside walls, the color Ruth had chosen, flower pots Pearl Whitfield brought and placed along the front porch, windows opened wide to let the wind from the lake move through every room, including Colette's room at the end of the hall, where the white curtains stirred softly in the afternoon sun, and the nursing shoes no longer sat lonely on the floor because their owner wore them to work every morning. Ruth was healthier. Her medicine was correct now. Her lungs were stable. The dry cough had disappeared in early spring, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, she slept through the night without waking at 3 o'clock in the morning to sit by the kitchen window and stare down the dirt road, waiting for the shape of her daughter. She didn't need to wait anymore. Walter built a new bookshelf for the living room. His hands still shook, because Parkinson's disease didn't disappear because of a miracle, or because of spring, but the work was more beautiful than anything he had made in the past 2 years, every joint tight, every planed surface smooth, because he wasn't rushing anymore. There was time. His daughter was home. There was a reason to do everything more slowly and more carefully. Colette returned to nursing, not in the emergency department at Mount Sinai in the heart of Manhattan, but at the small clinic in Watkins Glen, where the patients were farmers with sprained ankles during harvest season and children with fevers from teething, where the pace was slow enough that she wouldn't be thrown back into panic by the sound of an ambulance siren at midnight. Each week, she drove 40 minutes to Ithaca to see a therapist who specialized in trauma, and she still couldn't sleep with her bedroom door closed, still left it cracked open every night with Nero lying right at the threshold. But she had stopped apologizing every time she was afraid. That was the greatest progress she had made in 6 months. Learning how to be afraid without being ashamed of fear, because her therapist told her that fear, after 18 months of captivity, wasn't weakness. It was proof that she had survived, and survival was never something anyone needed to apologize for. Rick didn't live at the farm. He bought a small cabin near the lake, 15 minutes by car from the Aldridge house, the same distance he had kept for months, because Rick understood that closeness without an invitation was another kind of violation. He ran a legal business with money from the lawful side he had kept after giving most of the empire to the families, importing Italian wine from small producers in Sicily. He had known from the days when he still held power, and investing in a small restaurant in Watkins Glen, where he sometimes worked in the kitchen on Saturday nights, because Maria had taught him how to cook pasta before she taught him anything else. The Valenti empire still existed, but Rick had stepped back into a remote advisory role. Finch managed what remained, and Rick didn't become a saint, because saints don't exist in the real world. He simply chose not to write another chapter in a book he no longer wanted anyone to read. Nero recovered completely. The scar on his left shoulder healed. Black fur grew back over it, though thinner where the stitches had been, and the dog now divided his time between the farm and Rick's cabin, still running out to the porch every Saturday morning when he heard the pickup, even though Rick no longer needed to bring oak wood because he was now invited inside. One May afternoon, Rick met Colette at the old boat dock on Seneca Lake, where she often sat alone after work to look at the water and practice breathing in the rhythm her therapist had taught her. He sat down on the flat stone beside her, leaving enough distance for her to decide whether to narrow it or not, and said what he had known for a long time he needed to say, but had waited to say until she was strong enough to hear it. I didn't come to the farm that night by accident. I knew about your parents' land. I knew it sat in the exact position for the resort project, and I knew it was worth $12 million. Everything I did that first week, fixing the pipes, driving Price off, sitting there listening to your father tell his story, all of it was calculated. I came because of $12 million, not because I was kind. You deserve to know that. Colette looked at the lake. The wind blew her brown hair across her face. Nero lay at her feet on the wooden dock, the scar on his shoulder visible beneath the thinner patch of fur. I know, she said. Rick turned to look at her. I lived 18 months in a locked room by reading people, Colette said, her eyes still on the lake. I read the way you scanned a room, the way you sat with your back against the wall, the way your eyes calculated even when your mouth smiled. I knew you were false from the first week. I just didn't know you would truly change. You believe I truly changed? Rick asked. Colette looked down at Nero. The dog had his head resting on her foot, amber eyes open and calm on Rick, his tail still, his breathing even. I believe Nero, she said. That dog is never wrong about people. That Sunday night, the Aldridge farm dinner table had 4 people for the first time since Colette had walked back into the house after 18 months, and no one sat in a seat that didn't belong to them. Walter sat at the head of the table. Ruth sat on the left, Colette sat on the right, and Rick sat at the far end, across from Walter, in the chair no one had used before because it had always felt unnecessary. On the table was pasta made from Maria's recipe, which Rick had told Ruth about one afternoon the month before. Tomato sauce cooked slowly with fresh basil and a little chili, the way his mother had made it in the Brooklyn kitchen, with the cheapest ingredients in the market, though there had never been anything cheap about her hands. There was a bottle of red wine from Sicily, a small label Rick imported, the kind Maria used to drink at Christmas, only 1 glass, because she said more than 1 glass would be wasteful. Walter raised his glass with a trembling hand, the wine trembling lightly but not spilling, and he looked around the table, at his wife, at his daughter, at the man sitting at the far end, the man he had thrown out of his house in the rain 6 months earlier. I used to think strength meant enduring everything alone, Walter said, his voice slow and steady, each word placed carefully, like fitting a wooden joint into place. Turns out, that's often how people get trapped. He looked at Rick. Not fully warm, perhaps never fully warm, but no longer cold. And sometimes the person who unlocks the door is the same one who locked it. Ruth smiled. The first smile in nearly 2 years that reached her eyes, pale blue and wet, but not with sadness. Colette placed her left hand on the oak table. Rick looked at that hand, small, thin, the fingertips still carrying faint calluses from the 547 scratches on the concrete wall that he himself had caused. He placed his right hand on the table beside hers, close enough to feel the warmth, but far enough that she had the full right to choose, because it had taken Rick Valenti 37 years to understand that the only thing more valuable than power was another person's right to choose. Colette looked at the 2 hands on the table. Then she placed her fingers on the back of Rick's hand, lightly. Enough. Under the table, Nero lay with his head resting across both their feet, his amber eyes slowly closing, his breathing lengthening, deep and even. And the dog who had waited 18 months outside the door of a room whose owner didn't come home, finally slept for real for the first time since the night Colette disappeared, because everyone he loved was now in the same room, and no one needed him to stand guard anymore. Outside the windows of the Aldridge farm, the May evening sun poured gold over Seneca Lake and spread across the Finger Lakes Valley, and every door in the little house, the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedroom, and Colette's room at the end of the hall, stood wide open. Sometimes the strongest stories don't come from perfect heroes, but from imperfect people who dare to face what they have done wrong and pay a real price to repair it. This story reminds us that every person around us is a human being, not a problem to be handled, that the elderly deserve protection, not exploitation, that healing has no deadline, and fear is never something to apologize for, and that sometimes the person who unlocks the door is the same one who locked it, if they're willing to pay with everything they have. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can watch new stories every day. Please hit like and share this video with the people you love, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change the way someone sees the world around them. We'd truly love to know how you feel about this story and what it reminds you of in your own real life. So please share your thoughts in the comments below, because every comment from the depths of your hearts is the greatest motivation for us to keep telling stories worth telling. Wishing everyone watching this video very good health, a joyful life, and peace and calm in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.